I want to welcome everybody here. It's an honor to be on this panel today and to welcome Chairman Omali Yeshitela back to our conference, and Diep Olabala, Mwamba Ishitela. So this is going to be really powerful. As Jesse said, I'm a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. This is the organization of white people working in the white communities, when we say North American or European communities, organizing other people just like ourselves to recognize that African people are colonized inside the borders of the United States and struggling for liberation of African people as one people all around the world. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but the focus of my presentation right now is the fact that it is pretty well acknowledged that the U.S. is waging a war against the people of Afghanistan, and in its own self-definition, that war is a counterinsurgency, a war against people who are rising up to defend their own land and their freedom and their self-determination. But what is not widely recognized, what is not talked about, and what we don't see a stand taken around in this country is that the U.S. is also waging a war against the African community. And this is what I want to show, and I want to talk about that a little bit, and we will be discussing the reality of that tonight. Uhuru, so stop the war against the African community, and we say solidarity with the right of African people to resist, to have self-determination and liberation. The understandings in this presentation are based on the theory, it's called African internationalism, the theory of seeing the world through the eyes of the African working class, and this is the understandings of the Uhuru movement, and this theory was developed by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Under Obama, the U.S. is escalating the war in the Mideast and around the world. Obama's war budget is greater than that of any previous president, and that is really important to understand, that Obama represents the interests of white power, of imperialism. He is what the party calls neo-colonialism, and we saw under Bush some sense of an anti-war movement, but yet we have Obama escalating the war in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and in other parts of the Middle East, and we see no response except for the Black is Back coalition. We see just a paltry, weak kind of response, if at all, from the people who put themselves forward as the peace movement. Obama's war budget is nearly $700 billion. There's 150,000 troops in Afghanistan, a 600% increase in operations, in military acts and campaigns going on inside of Afghanistan right now. But what is not talked about is that Obama is also intensifying the other war, the war against the African community that goes on right before our eyes every day, here in St. Petersburg, in Philadelphia, and all around the world, all around the country. In Afghanistan, people are forced to live in a U.S. war zone. In the African community in the U.S., people live in a war zone. In Afghanistan, it's based on one of the most impoverished countries in the world. The people are colonized. They do not have power over their lives. They're fighting for their self-determination. Inside the U.S., African people are impoverished and colonized. 1/3 of all African children live in poverty. African people have 10 cents for every dollar that white people have in this country right now in 2011, and that gap is growing. In Afghanistan, it's a people under siege, military occupation. In the U.S., African community, it's a people under siege, under military occupation. We see special forces in Afghanistan. We see special forces in the U.S. African community. Every kind of SWAT team, every kind of highly militarized police force, every possible, I mean, how many different forces are implanted in the African community, DEA and SWAT and the Green Team and drug forces and every possible kind of police force that you could ever imagine. There are mercenaries in the Middle East, Blackwater, now called Z, mercenaries in the African community. And increasingly you're seeing that, where cities like Oakland, California, and of course this is New Orleans, but there are cities all over the country that can no longer afford their police budget, so they're jobbing the police out to mercenaries in the city. We have checkpoints famous in Palestine where the people are stopped and have to go through police interrogation and all kinds of searches in Palestine. This is well known, and it happens of course in Iraq and other places as well. Checkpoints in the African community is called stop and frisk. In New York City alone, 600,000, mostly African and other oppressed and colonized peoples, searched and stopped by the police there. Something like 250,000 or more in Philadelphia, and this is going on all over the country. There's U.S. tanks in Afghanistan. There's U.S. tanks in the African community. This was New Orleans. That's one example, but that's not the only example where that kind of military force is called out against the African community. U.S. helicopters over Afghanistan. U.S. helicopters, for one example, of course they're flying over the African community all the time. If you live in or near that, you can see that. But also, this is the helicopter that dropped the firebomb on the Move family's house in Philadelphia that killed 11 men, women, children, and burned down 63 homes in the African community in 1985. U.S. uses drones against the people of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Miami Police Department just bought a drone, and it says there are spy drones in demand by U.S. police, increasingly being used. Military police containment is what is happening in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. Police containment against the African community, and you can just note that's a U.S. postal truck that the police are coming out of. Collective punishment in Palestine, a whole people punished for the acts of, supposedly, of a few singled out. Collective punishment in the U.S. against the African community, exactly the same things are happening. We see mass roundups, imprisonment in Palestine and in Afghanistan, mass roundups, imprisonment of African people. In this country, where 2.5 million people are in U.S. prisons, 50% at least are African. You see U.S. murder of civilians in Afghanistan all the time. That has increased incredibly under Obama. Police murder of civilians in the African community. This is the murder, the blatant murder of Oscar Grant in Oakland, California on January 1st, 2009. And the only reason that was distinguished from any other police murder that goes on almost constantly in every city around the country is that it was on the BART station and the trains were in and people had their cell phones and they were videoing it and taking pictures of it. So they couldn't make up a story about what they said happened. People had the truth that this young man was shot point blank in the back by the police. We see torture. Abu Ghraib was only the most famous, infamous case that came out. Torture in U.S. prisons, which people are in 6 by 1 foot windowless cells called the SHU program. Tens of thousands of people are faced into that. There's many cases of cattle prods used against prisoners, fatal beatings, burnings by toxic chemicals, stun guns, inmates stripped naked and forced to crawl on the ground, rapes, years in sensory deprivation cells, 24 hours a day. All this was actually exposed on, this was a BBC documentary, Torture, America's Brutal Prisons, that came out about the same time that the exposures of Abu Ghraib And it also exposes that the guards, some of the guards at Abu Ghraib had been prison guards in the state of Pennsylvania and did the same thing there. Children are targeted in Afghanistan and Iraq. Thousands and thousands of children are targeted in the war on the African community. This is a 5-year-old arrested very brutally and put into handcuffs and taken to jail here in a school in St. Petersburg a couple of years ago. Occupying soldiers come back in body bags, and occupying police come back in body bags, because there is resistance and there are people fighting against this occupying war, this military force coming down against the people. And the Palestinian people have a right to resist. People in Afghanistan have a right to resist. And African people inside the U.S. have a right to resist. And we stand on the side of the right of African people to live without this constant military force on their backs, oppressing them in every possible way to uphold the status quo of this parasitic system built on the backs of African people. And from the Uhuru movement and the leadership of the chairman, we understand that the problem is not racism, that the problem is colonialism inside the U.S., because it is about a political and economic domination of a whole people for the benefit of the white population. In Afghanistan, the U.S. admits openly that this is a U.S. counterinsurgency. It's the occupation of a colonial people struggling to be free. In the U.S., it is beginning to admit that it is a counterinsurgency against the African community. This is a police, some kind of newsletter, and it says, "Urban Combat, the Petraeus Way," and General Petraeus is the U.S. Army expert on counterinsurgency who wrote the counterinsurgency manual. And it said the general's 8-point strategy for crime counterinsurgency applied to U.S. streets. You know that's not happening in the white community. That's happening against African people. And that in the Black Power movement of the 1960s, where we saw African people rising up all over this country as part of the main trend for revolution and national liberation, movements that were going on all over the world, and the U.S. reacted against that movement by implementing COINTELPRO, a whole program led by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI that was responsible for the assassination of people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, Illinois. It was responsible for imprisoning African people who are still in prison today from that period, like Sundiata Acoli, who's been in jail for the last 40 years because of standing up and struggling for the right of African people to be free. So counterinsurgency involves the U.S. government drug trade. U.S.-occupied Afghanistan is now 90% of the world's opium crop under U.S. occupation or more. But the U.S. is responsible also for imposing drugs and crack cocaine on the African community. This is a picture of Gary Webb, who wrote a book and did an expose in the San Jose Mercury News about how the U.S. and the CIA and the FBI were responsible for imposing crack cocaine and bringing it in from South America onto the African communities of this country. And the war against the African community has arrested, I've seen an estimated 30 million, mostly African young men over the past several years. But most drug users, because most of them are arrested for something to do with drug use, but most drug users and sellers are white. Yet African people are arrested and go to prison for that. 76% of African men in cities will be arrested and jailed before the age of 36. 60% of all children in prison are African. And to say, yes, the U.S. has tens of thousands of children in prison, probably one of the few countries in the entire world that keeps children in prison. U.S. more child prisoners than any place else in the entire world. More African people are tied to the prison system today than were enslaved in 1850. Obama's foreign war budget, $700 billion. The U.S. has spent over $1 trillion over the past 2 decades on the war against the African community. wars make billions of dollars, and the war on drugs in particular